Deltarune's soundtrack is weird. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm not talking about the structure of the music. Of course, I would never dare to besmirch Toby Fox's musical talent. I'm talking about some odd details that pop up when you take a closer look at the songs. And I'm not talking about how Toby reuses motifs. If you're looking for an analysis of that kind of thing, you should check out the Media Motifs channel. No, instead, I'm diving into these weird inconsistencies and also weird consistencies across both of the game's soundtracks and the in-game music itself. So let's go over some pretty basic and straightforward information that everyone probably knows already, just to make sure that we're all up to speed. So, Deltarune Chapter 1 was released on October 31st, 2018, and the official soundtrack was released on Bandcamp a day later, November 1st, and then on Spotify and other services the day after that. Then, Chapter 2 was released on September 17th, 2021, and alongside it came the next segment of the soundtrack. So, this is what I meant when I'm talking about the game's soundtrack. Not the music itself, but the officially released soundtrack that you can find on most audio distributing platforms. Anyways, getting back on track, due to the segmented nature of the game's release itself, the soundtrack is also segmented. Naturally, as new music was added to the game, the new soundtracks were created so that people can listen to said music. Now, I know at this point you're probably thinking, wow, thank you for the very boring true facts you've just given me. But see, this is where things start to get confusing. Like I said before, the Chapter 2 soundtrack has all the new songs from Chapter 2. But, if you remember in-game, there are a couple songs from the Chapter 1 soundtrack that reappear in-game in Chapter 2, but they don't make it onto the Chapter 2 soundtrack. There's actually a fair number of them, those songs being School, The Door, The Chase, Lancer, Rude Buster, Rules Card, Hip Shop, Gallery, Darkness Falls, The Holy, Your Power, A Town Called Hometown, You Can Always Come Home, and Before the Story. Now, that might seem weird at first, but if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. The goal of this soundtrack is to show off all the new songs, so it makes sense not to repeat ones that are already on the previous soundtrack. If you want to listen to those, you can just go back and listen to them. Not only that, but if soundtracks keep including repeating songs, then the soundtracks are just going to get exponentially bigger and bigger and bigger with each release. So at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, so what's supposed to be confusing about this? What's the issue here? The issue is, I've lied to you. 2 of these songs are on both soundtracks. Hopefully at this point, I don't need to spell out the issue. I just explained to you why it doesn't make any sense to have repeats between soundtracks, and yet here they are. Now, one of these songs I can come up with a possible explanation, but the other has been driving me insane for months now. Before we dive right into my descent into madness, let's take a look at the one I think can be explained, Before the Story. Now, not to gush about Toby's musical skill too much, but Before the Story is an absolutely fantastic piece. I think it's one of my favorites on the whole album. The song itself plays on the menu screen after you've completed a chapter, and because of that, it works really well as both a beginning and a send-off. On top of that, it incorporates the Once Upon a Time motif from back in Undertale, which is a really great way to kind of tie it all together. For all of those reasons, it makes for an absolutely fantastic final piece, and I think that's why it's on both albums as the last song. Or at the very least, that's the best justification I could come up with for keeping it on both. But of course, that just leads us to the song I can't explain. The one that's been driving me crazy for months. I gotta tell ya, I've racked my brain and I can't come up with a single explanation that can make any of this make sense. But enough teasing you. That other song that's been driving me crazy is You Can Always Come Home. I gotta tell you, I've been sitting here and thinking over and over and over again why this song would be on both, and I, for the life of me, could not explain why. And I know, some of you are probably hopping into the comments right now to go, oh, it's so obvious. Well, let me go through all the explanations I thought of and explain why none of them work. The first thing I thought of was location. You Can Always Come Home plays when you're in Toriel's house. it makes sense. That's a very important location. The location itself matters a lot to the story, especially at the ending of Chapter 2. That makes sense. Okay, but then why doesn't school appear? The school's a pretty important location. Maybe not as much in Chapter 2, but still, it's nonetheless a very important location. But, okay, Chapter 1 was where the school was most important. It doesn't matter as much in Chapter 2. Okay, that's fine. It doesn't play as big a role. We can move past it. However, there is another location that I would say is pretty important, and you actually spend more time here in Chapter 2 than you did in Chapter 1, but it doesn't get onto the soundtrack, and that place is Hometown. You know, the freaking town where the whole game takes place. That isn't important enough to get its song on both soundtracks, apparently, but Toriel's freaking house is. But okay, let's calm down. Maybe it's not about the importance of the location itself, but the thematic importance of the song. Considering Chapter 2 ends off with the next Dark Fountain being made inside Toriel's house, thematically it makes sense to include the song from Toriel's house on the soundtrack, right? Well, if we're going off thematic importance to choose which songs go on the soundtrack, then Toby forgot someone, because your power, arguably the single most important theme in the entire game, doesn't get on the Chapter 2 soundtrack. I would think that, the singular most important motif that appears in more songs than any other across the entire soundtrack, I would think that maybe that might have the thematic relevance to get on both soundtracks, but no! Friggin' You Can Always Come Home is what makes it. Now, maybe there's a reason out there. Maybe it just boils down to that Toby just really likes the track and wants it to be on both soundtracks, but I cannot think of a single logical reason for it to be on both. And at this point, I'm honestly terrified for the next soundtrack. I don't know if it's worse for it to be on the next soundtrack or for it to not be on the next soundtrack. I don't know what I'm going to do if it's not there, but I also don't know what I'm going to do if it is. Maybe I could come up with some kind of crazy off-the-wall theory to explain this, but I don't even know what to do with this. I mean, I just gave you all the reasons it doesn't make any sense. Where do I even start? Well, at the very least, I got to share this madness with you. At least it's finally over now. Except, it's not. I lied to you. Again! You see, the madness is only just beginning. This video was originally going to be in completely reversed order. That part was going to be the ending, and this part now is going to be the beginning. I was going to just record some interesting Deltarune trivia about the soundtrack and talk about some inconsistencies between the in-game music and the versions available on the soundtrack. I decided to take a little trip down the rabbit hole of Deltarune music trivia and ended up falling 40 stories into an abyss. What had started as some boring filler became a living nightmare for me. But before we can get into the part that really drove me crazy, we need to take a bit of a breath and start with some of the easier stuff. As I was saying, I was looking into some of the differences between the soundtrack and in-game versions of some of the songs. This might be a shock to some of you, but there actually are quite a few differences between the two versions. Now, if you're anything like me and you listen to the soundtracks on a daily basis, you might be wondering how these differences slipped past you. Well, first of all, don't worry, you're not losing your hearing or inattentive. The vast majority of these discrepancies are so incredibly tiny that you need to be looking for them deliberately to even notice them. As much as I would love to get into these tiny differences first, it's a bit difficult to talk about them. Foreshadowing. Instead, we're going to start with the easier to notice, larger discrepancies. If you've heard about any of these inconsistencies at all, then the one you've probably heard of is the one in Big Shot. Yep, you heard me correctly. One of Deltarune's most popular songs has the easiest to notice inconsistency. Right as the song is about to end, it plays a small snippet of the song Mad Dummy from Undertale. If you're a fan of both games, then you probably already picked up on that, but you might not have noticed that the in-game version has whispering voices layered over top of the music, and the soundtrack version doesn't have the voices and just plays the song. Let's take a listen to the soundtrack version. And now let's listen to the in-game version. Pretty weird, right? It's a very noticeable difference once you hear it. What I find even more interesting is that the in-game file for Big Shot is called Spampton Neo Mix EX WIP, or Work in Progress, which implies that maybe he just labeled it as Work in Progress or labeled it incorrectly and sent the wrong version to the soundtrack. It's impossible to say for certain what happened, but I find it interesting that, at least according to the file name, the version we hear in-game is unfinished. The next of the major inconsistencies can be found in the song Sans. That might be pretty shocking to hear, considering that the song is identical to the version from Undertale. It is literally a one-to-one carryover, both the in-game version and the soundtrack version. This is because it's actually an inconsistency that carries over from the Undertale soundtrack. Sans' theme is only 22 seconds long and has a seamless loop point at the end, so it just plays as long as it's needed to be playing. A 22-second song wouldn't be very good for a soundtrack, so on the soundtrack version it loops twice. However, you may notice that the soundtrack version is 51 seconds long, and if you do some quick math, it should only be 44 seconds long. The reason for the extra time is they add a little ending flourish, as I like to call it, on the end, where the main melody fades out and you just get some basic percussion until the song ends. Let's take a listen to that right now. I'm not certain of the exact reason as to why this was done, but I think it's just to make it sound a little bit better with the rest of the songs. Since the bass version is so incredibly short, it doesn't really make for a complete track. There's actually something very similar going on in the track Fanfare from Rose of Winter, where there's a little musical sting right at the end in the soundtrack version, but the in-game version just ends. Maybe I'm being a little too meticulous in considering this an inconsistency, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. And for the final major inconsistency, I have found one that I don't think I've seen anybody else talk about before. As far as I'm aware, I am the person to have first discovered this, and I'm actually very excited about that fact. I certainly would not be surprised if I'm the first to discover this. I only found it because I was going through every single song and listening to the in-game version and the soundtrack version back and forth over and over and over again. I discovered this inconsistency in the song The Door. Now, you don't have to fast forward or skip ahead in this song to find this inconsistency, because it can be heard within the first second. Let's start off with the soundtrack version. The song starts off with kind of a droning synth in the background, and then eventually you'll hear some bells and chimes playing a melody over top of it. I know I said the discrepancies right in the first second, but let's listen to the song a little bit so you can get an idea of what those chimes sound like. Alright, go back if you need to and listen closely to those chimes, because in the in-game version, as opposed to the soundtrack version, you can actually hear one of those chimes play right at the start of the song. In the soundtrack version, it's just the synth, but in the in-game version, you can hear a chime right at the first second. Pretty weird, right? I have no idea how or why this even happened, but I gotta be honest, I think it's really cool and I'm really happy that I discovered it. Now, unfortunately for all of us, the fun part is over. That's right, it's finally time for us to get into the heart of the madness. As mentioned previously, I was looking for ways to pad up this video, and as I was hunting for more discrepancies in the soundtrack, I remembered an old YouTube video I saw. It was uploaded shortly after Chapter 2's release by a channel called Frooster. It was called Deltarune Chapter 2 OST The Dark Truth In-Game. Now that was pretty interesting to read, as I had no idea that there was actually any difference between the in-game version and the OST version, so I gave it a listen. It sounded like it had either been pitched or slowed down, but I couldn't tell which one. Unfortunately for me, the comments and the description didn't offer much help in figuring out which it was, so I had to look elsewhere. After a bit more looking around, I stumbled across another video by a channel called VGM for You. This one uploaded a very similar video, but in the description it actually said what the difference was. According to VGM for You, The Dark Truth plays at -5% speed in-game compared to the soundtrack. I decided to look at more of their videos, and it turns out they have a full playlist of the in-game versions of songs, where they catalog tons of differences between the in-game and OST versions of the tracks. It turns out that apparently tons of the Deltarune songs play slightly faster or slightly slower than they do on the OST version. It's such a small difference that no one would blame you for never noticing it, but I was surprised by how many songs are slightly slower or faster. It's not really that interesting overall, but I thought it would make some nice filler, so I got ready to just throw it in my video and forget about it. But then, I made a terrible mistake. You see, I realized there was something kind of strange about the information given in these descriptions. How did they find the exact percentages that the songs were slowed down and sped up by? I mean, sure, if you look through it, the vast majority of the songs are allegedly slowed down by 5%, but some of them are sped up by 3% or slowed down by 3%. It's such a slight difference that you would never be able to pick up on that with just your ears alone. Where did VGM Music for You get this information? This was my horrible mistake, deciding to actually care about the video I was making and fact-check this information. So I started off with some basic research. I figured that VGM for You just pulled this information from some forum post somewhere, so I started looking around and I found nothing. I don't know if I'm just bad at using keywords or if I was just looking in the complete wrong places, but apparently nobody is talking about this at all. But then I thought to myself that I was just being ridiculous. All I had to do was pull up the in-game files and the OST files and compare the lengths. If the songs really were sped up or slowed down, I just need to compare the two timestamps of the different songs and do some simple math and find out the exact percentage difference. But you know what I found when I compared the songs? They were identical! Take a look for yourself, the timestamps are the same! So then I thought, maybe it's not sped up or slowed down, maybe it's just changed in pitch. As I learned in the Jaru video with his funny chipmunk voice, if you speed up audio, it has the same effect as pitching it up, and vice versa for slowing it down. Because of that fact, it's actually really hard to tell if something's been sped up or pitched up if it's a very small difference, say by like 5%. So I listened to both versions of all the songs again, and I even layered them over top of each other in Audacity, and nothing, they're identical. And this is the point where a new, horrifying realization slowly began to creep in. What if this change in speed or pitch is done through the game's code? I desperately tried to reassure myself. I didn't even know if that was possible to do in Gamemaker. But then I remembered the start of the Spamton Neo fight. Remember how when Spamton Neo starts to close in on Chris, the song in the background, Deal Gone Wrong, starts to play faster and faster? So it turns out, yes, you can control the speed of the song through code, which means I was going to have to do something I promised myself I would never do. I was going to have to learn how to understand Toby Fox's code. So I put on a brave face, downloaded Undertale mod tool, and opened up Deltarune's code. And immediately I encountered a very slight problem. Where am I supposed to find the music? There's not one big script that handles all the music. It's scattered across a whole bunch of scripts because there's a variety of different events that can trigger different songs to play. Which means that I have to search through every single line of code individually to find all the songs. Now, believe me, I really wanted to get accurate information, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to do all that. So sadly, I did not find the accurate numbers for every single song, but I did manage to find some of them. I made things a lot easier on myself by searching for music in the script's title, and I found a bunch of scripts called music or scripts, which naturally handle music. So while I wasn't willing to put in the 700 hours required to find every single song and get all of the numbers, I was able to find some of them, so hopefully that makes up for it. Before I start breaking this down, I'd like to give a massive thank you to Jay Coxeye, who I met in Andrew Cunningham's Discord server and helped me figure out exactly how this works. They helped to break it all down for me and explain exactly what each variable does and how they all connect to each other, and so I wouldn't have been able to do this without them. Alrighty, let's not delay anymore and dive right into the code. So, we're going to start off with one of those Musiker scripts I mentioned before, specifically the Musiker script for the Field of Hopes and Dreams. Now, how do I know this is the correct script to look at? I mean, Musiker_field is a pretty vague name. Well, all I gotta do is check the name of the song right here, and I can also see the line of code that makes that little pop-up happen when you first enter this area. Now, if you're not that familiar with Gamemaker or programming in general, this probably looks like a confusing mess of just random numbers and words, but don't worry, I'll break it down and explain it as best I can. Thankfully, we don't need to worry about the vast majority of this stuff. What we want to look at is this line right here with muse loop ext. As I pointed out before, the line above controls what song is playing, but this line here controls the song itself. There are a whole bunch of numbers here that control a variety of different, very important things, none of which I'm certain what they are, but don't worry, they don't matter for the sake of this video. All we need to focus on is this number 1 right here. That little number right there controls the music's speed. 1 is what it's set to by default, and it makes it play at 1 times speed. So in other words, normal speed. This makes use of a function that's built into GameMaker called audio sound pitch. Reading that name, you might be thinking the same thing that I was, which is, oh, so it does change pitch instead of speed. Despite the fact that it's called audio sound pitch, it actually does change the speed, thereby indirectly changing the pitch. That's kind of like saying that your car's pedal changes your speed. It is indirectly true, but the pedal is actually changing the acceleration, which in turn changes speed. This sounds like a minor nitpick, but do keep in mind that there could be, in both cases, unintended consequences if you're not aware of what it's actually doing. Anyway, I just wanted to point this out because I was surprised to find that it was not, in fact, the result of Toby's, interesting programming techniques, and was instead the result of GameMaker itself. Anyway, now that we know what we're looking at, let's move away from this example script and move on to something where we can actually see a difference in speed. The best script to look at for this is the Cyber City script, so let's take a look right now. The reason why this script works so well is because there's actually 2 different versions of the song that play depending on whether or not you're in the weird route. If you're on the weird route, the song is slowed down, and if you're on the normal route, the song is actually sped up. Future Salt with a quick correction, it turns out the weird route version plays 20% faster. I am unsure why. My explanation here is correct as far as I'm aware. If I was wrong, then the normal route should be slower, but it also plays faster. So regardless of if I'm wrong or not, one of these numbers is incorrect. My current theory is that there's another script that's setting the speed of these songs, but I haven't been able to find it yet. If I do find something, I'll update the pinned comment letting everybody know. But for now, I just wanted to correct this mistake. The rest of my explanation should still be accurate, but I didn't want to spread any misinformation. So if we take a peek here at this line, we can see the muse loop ext I told you guys to watch out for earlier, and we can see instead of the 1, there's a new variable called song speed. This is a nice little bit of extra confirmation that that 1 variable does in fact impact the song speed. Now let's take a look and see what song speed is set to. Up at the beginning of the script, we can see that if SCR side B get phase equals 2, then it sets the song to alt song and the song speed to 1.2. Wait a second, that's the alt song. Cyber City alt is the weird route song. According to this, it's playing at 1.2 times speed, so it should be playing faster, but I just said it's supposed to be playing slower. What is going on? What's going on is that I've lied to you once more. You see, this variable doesn't actually represent the song's speed. Oh, no, that would be far too simple. What this one actually represents is the song's length. It starts off at 100%, and by changing it, you raise or lower the amount of time the song is playing for. So what that does is it takes the same audio file, but just plays it for less or more time, thereby indirectly, because everything with this is indirectly changing the speed. I mean, I guess this works? I'm just angry because when I first found this, I thought that I'd either completely lost the plot or that all these people talking about the differences in speed were completely wrong, and now I need to go and figure out how they got these completely wrong numbers. Although, when I had it explained to me how this actually works, I realized that the numbers are still technically wrong, just not as wrong as I thought. Thanks to some math shenanigans I'm too tired and lazy to explain, there's actually a slight offset from what you might expect. For example, you might expect the weird route to be playing at 80% speed, but it's actually playing at 83.333% speed. And while you might expect the normal route to be playing 3% faster, it's actually just playing a little under 3.1% faster. Now, I know I sound extremely pedantic, and I am, but there actually is a reason I'm bringing this up. Because of the aforementioned math stuff, this discrepancy actually gets larger the further away this number gets from 1. So it's important to keep that in mind for any songs that have a more dramatic change in speed. Also, even if it is pedantic, maybe there are some people out there that want the most authentic recreation of Deltarune's soundtrack as humanly possible, so if you want those hyper-specific numbers, then you know how to find them now. Well, that's it. What, you wanted an answer to the mystery as to why these songs are sped up and slowed down? I couldn't tell you. Maybe Toby just liked them better this way. It could be as petty as that. Honestly, it was devastating to me that I had to put in so much effort for what amounts to just some very boring trivia, if I'm being honest. I mean, like I said, there's no real answers, there's no theory fodder, it's just random, boring trivia that took an astronomical amount of work to figure out, and I didn't even figure everything out! Well, at the very least, I can take solace in the fact that I'm dumping all my trauma onto you guys. Good luck!